The fluorescent lights hummed in the town hall as Jessica Vandermeer faced the mayor, her rage boiling over the notice that threatened everything she thought she owned. This wasn't a negotiation, it was the end of the line, and her arrogance was about to cost her everything. This is a story of power, pride, and the harsh lessons that come when entitlement collides with quiet resolve. If this story strikes a chord, tap like, subscribe for more, and drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. 6 months earlier, the only fluorescent hum in Michael Sterling's life came from the overhead light in his workshop. He was a man more comfortable with the solid heft of a wrench than the flimsy weight of a gavel. At 58, he was recently retired from a 40-year career as a master electrician and systems engineer, a job that taught him the immutable laws of cause and effect. You don't respect the current, you get burned. Simple as that. The mayorship of Northwood Creek had been a reluctant inheritance. The previous mayor, a good friend, had passed unexpectedly, and the town council, knowing Michael's reputation for no-nonsense integrity and deep local roots, had practically begged him to fill the term. He agreed, viewing it as a civic duty, a temporary detour from his true passion, the Sterling Lake property that had been in his family for 5 generations. It wasn't a grand estate, just a modest, well-kept clapboard house overlooking a pristine 5-acre lake, surrounded by a thick belt of ancient pine and oak. It was where his grandfather taught him to fish, where his father taught him to skip stones, and where Michael planned to spend his days teaching his own grandkids the same simple, profound lessons. The air there smelled of pine needles and damp earth, a scent more valuable to him than any currency. Michael's days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings were for town business, afternoons were for his workshop, and evenings were for sitting on his porch, watching the sunset paint the surface of his lake in shades of orange and violet. He was a man of quiet contentment, a blue-collar philosopher who believed that a good life was built on honest work, strong coffee, and respecting your neighbor's property lines. He knew every inch of his land, every gnarled root and mossy stone. It was a sanctuary, a living archive of his family's history. The water was a mirror, reflecting not just the sky, but the faces of everyone he had ever loved. He had no desire for conflict, no thirst for power beyond ensuring the town's streetlights worked and the trash was picked up on time. He believed in the simple principle of live and let live, a principle that had served Northwood Creek well for decades. He had no idea that a force of nature, a tempest of entitlement in a designer tracksuit, was about to move in next door and declare war on his peace, his history, and the very water that ran through his veins. The calm was about to be shattered, and the immutable laws of cause and effect were about to be put to the ultimate test. The first sign of trouble was the sound. It started as a distant rumble, a mechanical beast chewing at the edge of the woods that bordered his property. Then came the crashing of ancient trees, a sound that pained Michael down to his soul. The old Miller farm, a property that had been quiet for years, had been sold. Within weeks, a structure began to rise from the cleared earth, a monument to bad taste that locals quickly dubbed the Beige Behemoth. It was a sprawling, multi-gabled mansion of stucco and stone veneer, with a turret that seemed to sneer down at the modest, traditional homes of Northwood Creek. It was a house built not for living, but for showing off, and it stuck out like a sore thumb in a Monet painting. Michael watched its construction with a sense of unease. He believed a person's home was their castle, but this thing was an invading fortress. He checked the permits at the town hall, of course. They were all signed off by the previous building inspector, a man named Henderson who had retired to Florida just after the papers were filed. On the surface, everything looked legitimate, if ridiculously ostentatious. He hoped, for the sake of the neighborhood's tranquility, that the new owner would be less abrasive than their architectural choices. It was a hope that would be spectacularly, and quickly, demolished. The owner of the Beige Behemoth was Jessica Vandermeer. She arrived not in a moving truck, but in a cloud of dust from a pearl-white Range Rover, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair unruffled by the country air she seemed to find so offensive. Michael was in his yard, mending a section of the old stone wall his great-grandfather had built. When she first made her presence known, she didn't walk over to introduce herself. She stood on her newly laid, unnaturally green sod a good 50 yards away, and yelled, "You there!" Her voice was sharp, accustomed to summoning service. "Is that your water?" Michael straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. He gave a polite, neighborly nod. "Good morning. It's my lake, yes." Michael Sterling. He offered his name as a bridge, a standard Northwood Creek pleasantry. Jessica ignored it completely. "That's a community resource," she declared, not asked. "I'm the new president of the Chestnut Hills Homeowners Association. I'll be needing an access key for the community gate." Michael blinked. A slow, deliberate motion. "There is no community gate, ma'am. This is private property, and Chestnut Hills is the subdivision a mile down the road. This is just Northwood Creek." The dismissal of her self-appointed authority seemed to short-circuit her brain. Her perfectly lipsticked mouth opened and closed for a moment before she found her voice again. This time several decibels louder. "This is unacceptable. I will be looking into the town ordinances. You can't just hoard a natural resource like a dragon." And with that, she spun on her heel and marched back to her beige fortress, leaving Michael standing by his ancestral stone wall, a deep and troubling premonition settling in his gut. Michael's first call was to Arthur Pendleton, his neighbor on the other side. At 85, Arthur was the unofficial historian of Northwood Creek, a man whose memory was as long and clear as a summer twilight. He'd seen families come and go, seen the town change, but he'd never seen anything quite like the beige behemoth or its occupant. "Ah, yes," Arthur said, his voice crackling over the phone like dry leaves. "The Queen of Chestnut Hills has arrived to claim her new territory." Michael could hear the weary amusement in his old friend's tone. "Heard her yelling from my garden. Something about a community gate?" Michael sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "She seems to think my lake is a public pool, Arthur. Appointed herself president of an HOA that we're not even a part of." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Be careful with that one, Michael," Arthur said, his voice losing its light-hearted edge. "I knew the folks who sold her that land. She strong-armed them, threatened them with lawsuits over zoning disputes she manufactured out of thin air. They were old, tired, and just wanted out. She's a professional bully, thinks rules are for other people, but she'll use them like a club to beat you with if it gets her what she wants." The warning hung in the air, heavier than the summer humidity. Michael was a man who avoided conflict, but he was also a man who never backed down from a fight when it came to his principles or his family's legacy. He thanked Arthur for the insight and hung up, his gaze drifting out the window towards the placid, sun-dappled surface of his lake. A storm was coming, and its name was Jessica. The next few weeks were a campaign of escalating psychological warfare. It started with petty annoyances, loud, obnoxious music blasted from her patio at all hours, the bass thumping a discordant rhythm against the natural symphony of crickets and frogs. Her landscaping floodlights were aimed not at her own house, but directly at Michael's, turning his nights into a perpetual, artificial twilight. Then came the passive-aggressive notes left in his mailbox, printed on expensive, cream-colored stationery. They were filled with pseudo-legal jargon, citing non-existent, riparian access statutes, and community wellness ordinances, all demanding he grant access to the lake for the betterment of the neighborhood aesthetic. Michael, in his capacity as mayor, knew for a fact these statutes and ordinances were pure fiction. He simply filed them in a growing folder labeled Jessica, a folder that was already starting to feel ominously thick. He refused to engage, believing that starving her of the attention she so desperately craved was the best strategy. He continued his routine, mending his walls, tending his garden, and finding solace in the quiet hum of his workshop. He was a patient man, a man who understood that some problems, like a tangled wire, required careful, methodical untangling, not a frustrated yank. He was wrong. Jessica wasn't a tangled wire. She was a live one, flailing about, looking for something to burn. The confrontation he had been avoiding came on a Saturday morning. Michael was on his small wooden dock, enjoying his first cup of coffee and watching a family of ducks paddle serenely across the water. It was a perfect, peaceful moment, the kind he cherished most. That peace was shattered by Jessica's shrill voice carrying across the property line. "I see you. I see you out there, enjoying my view." She was standing on her meticulously manicured lawn, dressed in tennis whites, her hands on her hips. My guests are arriving for a garden party, and they were under the impression they would have lake access for kayaking. Michael took a slow sip of his coffee before turning to face her. "Good morning, Jessica," he said, his voice calm and even. "As I've explained before, this is private property. It's not a resort." Her face contorted into a mask of theatrical disbelief. "Private property? Don't be absurd. Water belongs to everyone. This is a gross violation of my rights as a homeowner and as president of the HOA. He decided to try logic one more time. "Jessica, you can't be president of an HOA you invented that only has one member. That's not how it works. This lake has been in my family for over 100 years. No one has ever had a problem respecting that." Her response was a spittle-flecked tirade. "Your history doesn't supersede my rights. I pay significant property taxes. I will not be bullied by some backwoods hillbilly. I am calling the authorities. We'll see what the police have to say about your little water hoarding scheme." True to her word, less than 20 minutes later, a Northwood Creek police cruiser pulled into Michael's long gravel driveway. 2 officers got out, a veteran, Sergeant Miller, and a younger officer Michael didn't recognize. Miller, a man Michael had known for 30 years, looked deeply apologetic. "Morning, Mike," he said with a sigh, tipping his hat. "Sorry to bother you. We got a rather insistent call from your new neighbor." Michael gestured towards his porch. "Coffee, Dave?" The younger officer looked surprised by the casual exchange, but Miller just nodded. "Maybe later. We just have to go through the motions here. Ms. Vandermeer is claiming you are illegally blocking public access to a waterway, and that you threatened her. The same stelide and to reverse. My dot to reversed and the most and diverse." Michael let out a low, humorless chuckle. "The only threat she perceived, Dave, was to her sense of entitlement. I told her the lake was private. She seems to have a hard time with that concept." He watched as Jessica marched towards the property line, a smug, triumphant look on her face. Her phone held up as if she were recording the whole encounter for a dramatic social media post. She was clearly expecting to see him reprimanded, perhaps even arrested. She was about to be sorely disappointed. Sergeant Miller walked over to the edge of Michael's property, the younger officer trailing behind him. Jessica stood on her side, arms crossed. "Officer," she began, her voice dripping with condescension, "I want this man cited for violating public access laws. He is hoarding this entire lake for himself." Miller looked from her to the lake, then back to the official plat map he had pulled up on his in-car computer. He pointed to a small, iron survey marker nearly hidden in the grass. "Ma'am," he said, his voice patient but firm, "according to the official county records, this property line is correct. The lake, the dock, and all surrounding land are the private property of Mr. Sterling. There is no public easement, no public access, right of way, nothing. He's well within his rights to deny you access." Jessica's smug expression dissolved into sputtering indignation. But that's ridiculous. Look at it. It's a lake. Your records must be wrong. I demand you check again. I am a very influential member of this community." The younger officer, trying to be helpful, chimed in. "Ma'am, we have the official records here. And besides, Mr. Sterling is—" Sergeant Miller cut him off with a subtle but sharp glance, a silent command to stand down. He knew Michael preferred to keep his public and private lives separate. The last thing Michael wanted was to be seen as a mayor pulling rank in a neighborly dispute. Jessica, however, was not one to be deterred by facts or authority. "This is an outrage, an abuse of power. You're clearly friends with him. You're all part of the same good old boys club," she shrieked, her voice echoing across the tranquil water. "I will be filing a formal complaint against this entire department for dereliction of duty. I will have your badges." Sergeant Miller's patience, which was usually considerable, was clearly wearing thin. His voice dropped, losing its neighborly warmth and taking on the cold, hard edge of law enforcement. "Ma'am, you are free to file any complaint you wish. However, if you continue to make false reports, that constitutes a crime. And if you set one foot on Mr. Sterling's property without his permission, that will be criminal trespass. Are we clear?" The threat, clear and legally binding, finally seemed to penetrate her bubble of entitlement. She stared at him, her mouth agape, utterly flabbergasted that the world and its laws were not conforming to her will. Defeated for the moment, she shot Michael a look of pure venom, a silent promise that this was far from over, before spinning around and storming back to her house. As the cruiser drove away, Miller gave Michael a final, weary look. The police call had solved nothing. In fact, it had done the opposite. It had been a public declaration of war. Michael stood on his porch, the coffee in his mug now cold, and watched her house. The gloves were off. She had tried to use the law as a weapon against him. It was an interesting choice of tactics, he thought. A slow, cold anger beginning to replace his frustration. It was time he took a closer look at how well she followed the rules herself. That afternoon, Michael didn't go to his workshop. He went to his small, unassuming office at the town hall. As mayor, he had access to every public record, every permit filed, every inspection report. It wasn't a power he used lightly, but Jessica's repeated, baseless accusations of him being a lawbreaker had flipped a switch. It was a matter of principle. He started with the basics, the original building permits for the Vandermeer property. He pulled up the digital files, his engineering eye scanning the blueprints and schematics. The plans were ambitious, even for a house that size, but they had all been stamped and approved by Howard Henderson, the recently retired inspector. But something immediately caught Michael's eye. It was a detail on the electrical plan, a sub-panel designation that didn't quite align with the specified load calculations. It was a small thing, something a layman would never notice, but to a master electrician like Michael, it was a glaring red flag. It was like a single, misspelled word in a legal document. It cast doubt on the integrity of the entire thing. He cross-referenced it with the town's electrical code, a document he knew better than the back of his own hand. Just as he suspected, it was a clear, unambiguous violation. Not a major one, perhaps, but it was the first crack in the foundation of Jessica's perfectly constructed world. He kept digging. He cross-referenced the architectural plans with the land survey. Another discrepancy. The original plan called for a large, detached garage. The satellite view of the property, however, showed that the garage wasn't detached at all. It was connected to the main house by a newly constructed enclosed breezeway, effectively making it a massive, unpermitted addition. This wasn't a minor code violation. This was a significant structural change that would have required a whole new set of permits, inspections, and, most importantly, a much higher property tax assessment. He pulled the tax records. She was being taxed for a detached garage, a fraction of the value of the sprawling connected structure that now stood on the property. 1. E. A sly, cynical smile touched Michael's lips for the first time that day. Jessica Vandermeer, the self-proclaimed champion of rules and ordinances, was a tax cheat. This was no longer about a dispute over a lake. This was about a fundamental disrespect for the community and the laws that held it together. The chessboard was now clear in his mind. She had made her move with the police, a brash, emotional attack. Now, it was his turn to make a quiet, calculated one. The next morning, Michael made a call to David Chen, the town's new head building inspector. David was a young, sharp, by-the-book professional whom Michael had personally hired to replace the suspiciously lax Henderson. He respected David's meticulous nature and his unwavering commitment to safety and procedure. "David, it's Michael Sterling. I've got a question for you. Off the record for a moment." He explained the situation calmly and factually, laying out the discrepancies he'd found in the Vandermeer permits and the reality of what was built on the land. He didn't mention the harassment or the lake. He kept it strictly professional. He was the mayor, concerned about a potential major code and tax violation in his town. On the other end of the line, David was silent for a long moment. "An enclosed breezeway? That's interesting, Mike," he said finally, his voice tight with professional curiosity. "Because I'm looking at the final inspection report from Henderson, and he signed off on a detached structure. If what you're saying is true, that's not just a violation. That's fraud." The word hung in the air. This was escalating faster than Michael had anticipated. What had started as a neighborly nuisance was rapidly spiraling into a criminal investigation. David continued, "There's only one way to know for sure. I'll need to conduct a site inspection. I can issue a notice of a potential code violation review based on the satellite imagery discrepancy. It's thin, but it's enough to get me on the property legally." The official notice was sent by certified mail. 2 days later, Michael received a phone call. It was Jessica, and she was incandescent with fury. "How dare you?" she screeched into the phone, her voice so loud he had to hold the receiver away from his ear. "How dare you send your little bureaucratic thugs to my home? This is harassment. It's a pathetic, vindictive abuse of your power, and it is completely transparent. 03. Michael let her vent, listening patiently to the storm of accusations and threats. When she finally paused to take a breath, he spoke, his voice the calm center of her hurricane. "Jessica, the building inspector's office operates independently. They received a tip about a potential discrepancy between the filed plans and the existing structure. It's a routine procedural matter. If everything is in order, they'll be in and out, and you'll have nothing to worry about." His calm, bureaucratic explanation seemed to enrage her even more. "Oh, I know it was you, you coward. You couldn't win the argument, so you hide behind your title. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I have lawyers who will tie you and this entire hick town up in litigation for a decade." The line went dead. Michael hung up the phone, a grim expression on his face. Her threat wasn't idle, but her panic was also telling. She was afraid, and people who are afraid of a routine inspection usually have something very serious to hide. David Chen's inspection was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Jessica, accompanied by a slick-looking lawyer in a suit that cost more than Michael's truck, was waiting on the doorstep. She was outwardly hostile, while the lawyer was a picture of professional obstructionism, questioning every step of David's process. But David was unshakable. He was polite, professional, and armed with a warrant. He started with the breezeway. It took him less than 5 minutes to confirm Michael's suspicion. It was an unpermitted addition, a clear and significant violation. But that, it turned out, was just the tip of the iceberg. As David moved through the house, his face grew more and more grim. In the basement, he found a massive, finished home theater and wine cellar that didn't exist on any of the plans. The electrical work, as Michael had first suspected, was a nightmare. Junction boxes were left open. Wiring was improperly grounded. It was a fire trap, a flagrant disregard for the most basic safety codes. The lawyer's confident smirk began to falter as David's list of violations grew, each one meticulously documented with a camera and a notepad. The worst discovery was made outside. Behind a screen of professionally planted mature hedges, David found the control panel for a secondary septic system. The property was permitted for a standard system, adequate for a 3-bedroom house. But Jessica's 5-bedroom, 7-bathroom mansion, with its industrial-sized kitchen and multiple laundry rooms, was generating far more wastewater than the original system could handle. So, she had simply had another one installed, illegally and completely off the books. David took soil samples around the unmarked leach field. "This is bad, Mike," he told Michael later that day, his voice low and serious. "The unpermitted system is undersized, improperly installed, and it's too close to the water table. The runoff is almost certainly leaching nitrates and bacteria directly toward your lake." The news hit Michael like a physical blow. This wasn't just about property lines and code violations anymore. Jessica's arrogance and disregard for the rules were actively poisoning the one thing he held most sacred. She was killing his family's legacy from the underground up. The righteous indignation that had been simmering within him now boiled over into cold, hard resolve. She had made this personal. Now, she would face the full consequences. Not just as a homeowner, but as the mayor of the town whose health and safety she had so recklessly endangered. The initial findings were enough for David to issue a stop work order on any ongoing landscaping and to red tag the illegal additions, meaning they were officially condemned and could not be used. The news sent shockwaves through the small community. People had disliked the ostentatious house and its obnoxious owner from the start, but the idea of it being a dangerous, illegal structure was a whole other level of scandal. Suddenly, other neighbors started to come forward, forming a small but determined group. They were the rallied community. One family, the Garbers, had been in a year-long dispute with Jessica over a fence she had built 3 feet onto their property. They had tried to resolve it amicably, but she had buried them in legal threats until they gave up, unable to afford the fight. Another neighbor, a retired plumber, mentioned that he had seen the trenching for the illegal septic system being done at night by an unmarked truck, a detail he had thought was odd, but hadn't wanted to get involved. Each story painted a clearer picture of Jessica's pattern of behavior: bully, intimidate, and break any rule that stood in the way of what she wanted. They had all been too afraid or too isolated to fight back on their own. But now, with the mayor's office officially investigating, they found their courage. Arthur Pendleton, the wise elder, provided the missing piece of the puzzle. He called Michael one evening, his voice hushed with a conspiratorial tone. "Michael, I was talking to my niece. She's a realtor over in the next county. She said this Vandermeer woman has a reputation. This is her business model." He explained that Jessica would buy properties in unincorporated or loosely regulated areas, build massive, non-compliant houses on them using cheap, non-union labor, and then use a combination of intimidation and legal loopholes to get them signed off. She would then either flip them for a massive profit before any real scrutiny could occur, or, as in the case of Northwood Creek, try to establish a power base by taking over a local HOA. "And Henderson," Arthur added, his voice grim. "The old building inspector. My niece said he signed off on 2 of her other properties over there before he retired. They found major structural problems in both houses after the new owners moved in. The connection was undeniable. This wasn't just a case of an entitled homeowner cutting corners. This was a pattern of systemic, calculated fraud, aided and abetted by a corrupt official. The scope of the problem had expanded exponentially. Michael now had a duty not just to his own property, but to protect his town from predators like Jessica and to root out any corruption she had left in her wake. Armed with this new information and the testimony of his neighbors, Michael knew he had to escalate things beyond the town's code enforcement office. This was a matter for the county, and potentially the state. He convened a special, closed-door session with the town council and David Chen. He laid out the entire case, from the initial harassment to the discovery of the illegal septic system and the deeply troubling connection to the former building inspector. "This isn't just about one house," Michael told them, his voice ringing with the authority he so rarely chose to wield. "This is about the integrity of our town's governance. It's about ensuring that no one, regardless of their wealth or influence, is above the law. We have evidence of tax fraud, environmental endangerment, and potential bribery of a public official. We need to bring in the district attorney." The council, a group of sober-minded citizens who had seen Michael as a quiet caretaker, were stunned. They saw a new side of their mayor that day, not the reluctant politician, but a determined leader, a fighter. They voted unanimously to support his recommendation. The small-town squabble over a lake was now a full-blown criminal investigation, and Jessica Vandermeer was at the very center of it. The involvement of the district attorney's office changed the game completely. Investigators, armed with subpoenas and a much broader jurisdiction, descended on Northwood Creek. They subpoenaed Jessica's financial records, the business records of the contractors she used, and, most importantly, the banking history of the retired inspector, Howard Henderson. It didn't take them long to find what they were looking for: a series of large, unexplained cash deposits into Henderson's accounts, all occurring within days of his signing off on Jessica's permits and final inspections. It was the smoking gun. Henderson, tracked down to his Gulf Front condo in Florida, quickly folded under the threat of federal charges and agreed to testify against Jessica in exchange for a plea deal. The case against her was now a fortress. The illegal additions, the faulty wiring, the environmental hazards, those were just the physical evidence. Henderson's testimony was the key that unlocked her intent. It proved that this wasn't a mistake or an oversight. It was a deliberate, criminal conspiracy to defraud the town and endanger its residents, all for her own profit and convenience. She had built her beige castle on a foundation of lies, and now the walls were about to come crashing down. While the criminal case was being built, David Chen's department had enough evidence to proceed with the town-level consequences. The sheer number and severity of the violations were staggering. The illegal septic system alone was a public health emergency, and the electrical work was deemed an imminent fire hazard. The unpermitted additions compromised the structural integrity of the entire building. David compiled a comprehensive report, over 100 pages long, detailing every single infraction, complete with photographs, soil sample results, and expert analyses. His final recommendation was unequivocal. The structure was, in his professional opinion, unfit for human habitation, and posed a clear and present danger to the health and safety of the public. He recommended that the town council vote for full condemnation. It was the nuclear option. It meant the house could not be sold. It could not be lived in. And it would either have to be brought fully up to code, an astronomically expensive and likely impossible task, or be torn down completely, the weapon Jessica had tried to use against Michael. The bureaucracy and the rule of law had been turned against her with devastating and perfectly legal precision. The town council meeting was packed. The Garbers were there. The retired plumber was there. Dozens of other residents from Northwood Creek and the adjacent Chestnut Hills subdivision filled the seats. Jessica Vandermeer was there too, this time with a team of 3 lawyers. She looked pale and drawn, the mask of arrogant confidence finally stripped away, replaced by a desperate, cornered fury. David Chen presented his report, his voice steady and professional as he walked the council through the mountain of evidence. He presented slides of the faulty wiring, diagrams of the failing septic system, and the structural analysis showing the compromised load-bearing walls. When he was finished, a heavy silence fell over the room. As mayor, Michael presided over the meeting, but he recused himself from the final vote to avoid any appearance of a conflict of interest. He simply facilitated the process, a neutral arbiter watching the wheels of justice he had set in motion turn. Jessica's lawyers tried to argue, claiming it was a personal vendetta, a targeted harassment campaign. But they couldn't refute the physical evidence. They couldn't argue with the soil samples or the electrical readings. Their bluster was met with the cold, hard facts of Jessica's own malfeasance. The vote was a formality. One by one, the council members voted in favor of condemnation. The motion passed unanimously. A quiet, collective sigh of relief went through the audience. It was a victory not just for Michael, but for the entire community, a reaffirmation that their town was not for sale to the highest bidder or the biggest bully. Michael looked across the room at Jessica. Her face was a ruin of disbelief and rage. She had come to Northwood Creek, expecting to dominate, to bend a small town to her will. She had seen Michael as nothing more than a stubborn old man, an obstacle to be removed. She had fundamentally misunderstood the man she was dealing with and the community he represented. He wasn't just an electrician. He was an engineer who understood systems, both electrical and social. And she wasn't just a nuisance. She was a fault in that system, a dangerous surge of power that had to be contained and grounded before it burned the whole place down. The gavel fell, the meeting was adjourned, and the fate of the beige behemoth was sealed. This brings us back to that fluorescent-lit room, the final act in a drama of Jessica's own making. The condemnation notice wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the physical manifestation of her downfall, the sum of all her arrogance and deceit. "This is my home," she hissed again, her voice cracking. "You are a petty, vindictive little man." Michael finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of the last 6 months. "No, Jessica. This isn't about me, and it isn't about my lake. Not anymore. This is about a house with wiring that could kill a family. It's about a septic system that's poisoning the groundwater. It's about the fact that you bribed a public official and put this entire community at risk for your own convenience. Crossed into the grave." He stood up, his tall frame seeming to fill the small room. "I didn't do this to you. You did this to yourself. Every violation, every lie, every shortcut that was you. This," he said, gesturing to the crumpled paper in her hand, "is just the bill coming due. This is cause and effect." The sheriff stepped forward, his duty clear. "Vandermeer, you have 48 hours to vacate the premises. The property is now officially seized by the town of Northwood Creek, pending demolition or remediation." Her lawyers ushered her out, still sputtering threats, and promising lawsuits that they and she now knew were utterly toothless. In the weeks that followed, the full scope of Jessica's comeuppance became clear. Faced with insurmountable evidence and Henderson's testimony, she pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including bribery and felony fraud. She avoided jail time but was hit with crippling fines and a lengthy probation. The financial ruin, however, was the real punishment. The cost to bring her monstrous house up to code was estimated to be more than the initial construction cost. She was trapped. She couldn't live in it. She couldn't sell it. And she couldn't afford to fix it. The beige behemoth, her monument to ego, sat empty and condemned, a constant, humiliating reminder of her defeat. Eventually, the bank foreclosed on the property. The house was deemed unsalvageable and was unceremoniously demolished. The land was sold to a local conservation trust, which pledged to return the scarred patch of earth to its natural, wooded state. The source of the poison, both literal and figurative, had been removed from Northwood Creek. A month after the demolition, Michael Sterling hosted a barbecue on the shore of his lake. The entire neighborhood was invited. The Garbers were there, their property line now properly restored. Arthur Pendleton was there, holding court in a lawn chair, telling stories of the old days. David Chen was there, off the clock, enjoying a well-deserved beer. It was a celebration of community, a testament to the quiet strength of ordinary people standing together against a bully. As the sun began to set, casting its golden light across the water, Michael stood on his dock, a feeling of deep, profound peace settling over him. He had never wanted this fight. He had been content in his quiet life. But when pushed, he had fought back. Not with anger and threats, but with meticulousness, integrity, and the simple, unshakable power of the truth. The lake was calm, its surface a perfect mirror reflecting the clear evening sky. It was safe. His family's legacy was secure. And as he watched the children of his neighbors laugh and skip stones across the water, he knew that the community of Northwood Creek was safer, stronger, and more united than it had been in a very long time. That evening, as the last of his guests departed, Michael sat on his porch, just as he had for countless evenings before. The obnoxious floodlights from next door were gone, replaced by the gentle light of the stars. The thumping bass of Jessica's parties was gone, replaced by the familiar, soothing chorus of crickets and frogs. He thought about the phrase Jessica had thrown at him in their very first conversation. "You can't just hoard a natural resource like a dragon." It was ironic, he mused. In her greed, she had been the dragon, a creature of avarice and destruction, breathing fire and poison, trying to claim a treasure that wasn't hers. She had seen his peaceful life and his beautiful lake not as something to be respected, but as something to be conquered and consumed. But she had misjudged her opponent. Michael wasn't a knight in shining armor. He was a quiet caretaker, a man who understood that some treasures are not meant to be hoarded, but to be protected. He had simply done what was necessary to defend his home, his heritage, and the town he had reluctantly, but dutifully, agreed to lead. The balance had been restored. Northwood Creek was at peace. The story of the beige behemoth and the battle for Sterling Lake became a local legend, a cautionary tale about arrogance and the quiet resolve of the Northwood Creek community. Michael finished his term as mayor and, despite popular demand, politely declined to run again. He had done his civic duty. He returned full-time to his workshop, his family, and his lake, his contentment deeper and more earned than ever before. Occasionally, new residents would hear the story and ask him about it. He would just smile and say, "Around here, we believe in being good neighbors, and we believe in following the rules. It's as simple as that. Pew, this was Reamley, by the miner's cell." The land where Jessica's mansion once stood began to heal. Young saplings started to push their way through the soil where the foundation had been. The woods began to slowly, patiently reclaim their own. It was a quiet, natural victory, a reminder that some things, like the roots of an old oak or the principles of a good man, are stronger and more enduring than any structure built on a foundation of lies. The battle was over, and the peace that followed was the ultimate prize, a treasure worth defending against any dragon that dared to challenge it. Michael's specific expertise as an electrician had been the key that unlocked the entire investigation. It was his trained eye that first spotted the anomaly in the blueprints, the tiny thread that, when pulled, unraveled Jessica's entire fraudulent enterprise. Had he been a lawyer, a banker, or anything else, he might have never seen it. It was a perfect example of the blue-collar wisdom he embodied. You can't build a solid house if the wiring is bad. The same was true for a person's character or for a legal case. Jessica's entire life was a shoddy wiring job, full of shortcuts and dangerous connections, just waiting for an expert to expose it. This fact was not lost on the people of Northwood Creek. They saw that their reluctant mayor's strength didn't come from a fancy degree or a political pedigree, but from decades of honest, hands-on work. He understood how things were built, and more importantly, how they fall apart. He had a deep, practical knowledge that proved far more powerful than Jessica's team of expensive lawyers. It was a victory for the everyman, a validation of the idea that integrity and expertise will always, eventually, triumph over arrogance and deceit. The professional ally, David Chen, became a close friend of Michael's. The trial by fire they had endured together forged a bond of mutual respect. David often said that working the Vandermeer case was the most important work of his career. It taught him that the small, seemingly boring details of the building code were, in fact, the very things that protected a community from chaos and danger. He became a zealous defender of his town's regulations, known for his fairness, but also for his refusal to be intimidated. The era of the good old boys club that Jessica had accused them of was well and truly over, replaced by an era of transparency and accountability, with David as its unwavering guardian. The rallied community, the Garbers and the others, also remained a tight-knit group. They started a neighborhood watch program and became more active in town council meetings, their shared experience having taught them the importance of vigilance and solidarity. They had found their collective voice, and they were never going to be silenced by a bully again. The crisis had, in the end, made them all stronger and more connected. Jessica Vandermeer, for her part, disappeared from Northwood Creek and from the society pages she so desperately wanted to inhabit. Her name became synonymous with scandal. The massive fines and legal fees wiped out a significant portion of her wealth, and her reputation was irrevocably destroyed. The dragon had been declawed and defanged, left with nothing but the ashes of her own ambition. The irony, a detail Michael found particularly satisfying in his quiet moments, was that her downfall was a direct result of her own actions. If she had simply been a good neighbor, if she had respected his property line and accepted the simple answer of no, she would still be living in her beige mansion. But her insatiable need for control, her belief that everything and everyone should bend to her will, was the fatal flaw that led her to challenge a man who was uniquely equipped to dismantle her entire world. She had started a war over a lake, and in the end, she had lost everything. Learning the hardest lesson of all: when you try to take what isn't yours, you often lose what you already have. The seasons turned. Summer gave way to the crisp, cool air of autumn. The leaves of the oaks surrounding Sterling Lake turned brilliant shades of red and gold, their reflection a masterpiece on the water's surface. Michael sat on his porch, a warm mug of coffee in his hands, watching his grandchildren attempt to skip stones, their joyous laughter echoing in the quiet air. He had faced the biggest challenge of his life, and had emerged not just victorious, but with a renewed appreciation for the peace he had fought so hard to protect. The mayorship was a chapter of his life he was glad to have closed, but he was proud of what he had accomplished. He had defended his home, and in doing so, had cleansed his town of a corrupting influence, leaving it better and more resilient than he had found it. He was, once again, just Michael Sterling, master electrician, grandfather, and quiet guardian of a small, perfect piece of the world. And as a gentle breeze rustled the leaves, it seemed as if the land itself was breathing a sigh of relief. Finally at peace, the dragon was gone, the treasure was safe, and the caretaker was home. What had started as a petty demand for access to a lake had become a righteous crusade for the soul of a community. Michael never saw himself as a hero. He saw himself as a man who had been pushed into a corner and had simply pushed back with the tools he had. His tools weren't fists or weapons. They were knowledge, patience, and an unshakable belief in the rule of law. He demonstrated that true power isn't about shouting the loudest or having the most money. It's about standing firm on a foundation of integrity. Jessica's power was a facade, a mansion built on corrupt soil with a rotten frame. Michael's power was quiet, solid, and as deep as the roots of the ancient trees that guarded his property. It was the power of a man who knew who he was, where he came from, and what was worth fighting for. And in the end, that was a power that no amount of money or influence could ever hope to defeat. His legacy wasn't just the lake anymore. It was the example he set for the entire town of Northwood Creek. The story serves as a powerful reminder that the Karens of the world, the petty tyrants who thrive on intimidation and the bending of rules, often have the most to hide. Their aggression is a shield, their condescension a smokescreen to hide their own deep-seated insecurities and, often, their own flagrant disregard for the very rules they try to weaponize against others. Jessica believed she was untouchable. Wrapped in a cloak of wealth and self-importance, she poked and prodded at Michael, assuming he was just another person who would eventually fold under her relentless pressure. She never once considered that the quiet, unassuming man in the work boots was the one person with the unique combination of skills, position, and motivation to not just resist her, but to systematically unravel her entire world. 1-0. It's the ultimate irony. In her obsessive quest to control a small piece of his world, she gave him the motivation to expose the fraudulent nature of her own, leading to its complete and utter destruction. She handed her enemy the blueprints to her own downfall. Arthur Pendleton often joined Michael on his porch in the evenings that followed. They would sit in comfortable silence, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance over the water. One evening, Arthur broke the quiet. "You know," he said, swirling the ice in his glass of tea, "my father always used to say, never mistake a quiet man for a weak one. The loudest rooster in the barnyard isn't the one you have to worry about. It's the patient hawk circling high above that you need to respect." Michael nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. He had never thought of himself as a hawk, but he understood the sentiment. His patience was his greatest weapon. He had let Jessica reveal her entire strategy, her every weakness, before he made a single move. It was a chess match, and she had been playing checkers, knocking over the pieces with wild abandon, while he was calmly, quietly, lining up his checkmate. Arthur raised his glass. "To the patient hawk of Northwood Creek," he said with a wink. Michael chuckled and clinked his coffee mug against the glass. The title was a bit dramatic for his tastes, but the sentiment was one he could certainly appreciate. Years later, when Michael's grandchildren were old enough to understand, he would take them out on the small fishing boat, the electric motor humming softly. He would point to the now dense woods where the beige behemoth once stood. He wouldn't tell them a story of revenge or anger. He would tell them a story about responsibility. "That place over there," he'd say, "is a reminder. It's a reminder that being part of a community means you have to respect it. You have to respect your neighbors, and you have to respect the rules that keep everyone safe." He would look them in the eyes, his gaze serious but kind. "It doesn't matter how much money you have or how important you think you are. If your foundation is bad, eventually, the whole house will come down." And then he would smile, bait a hook for them, and go back to teaching them the simple, profound lessons of fishing, of patience, and of the quiet, enduring strength that came from doing things the right way. The water would lap gently against the boat, a timeless rhythm, a promise of peace well earned and fiercely protected. The tale of Michael and Jessica became a sort of stress test for the town itself. It revealed the weaknesses in the system, like the corruptible nature of the previous inspector, but it also revealed its strengths, the integrity of men like David Chen, the solidarity of the community, and the inherent power of the law when applied correctly and without prejudice. The town council implemented new checks and balances in the building and permitting departments, ensuring that a situation like Jessica's could never happen again. There was a renewed sense of civic engagement among the populace. People paid more attention, they showed up to meetings, and they understood that the health of their community was a shared responsibility, not something to be taken for granted. Jessica, in her destructive wake, had inadvertently made Northwood Creek a better, more transparent, and more resilient town. It was the final, stinging irony of her story. Even in her complete and utter failure, she had ended up contributing to the betterment of the neighborhood, just not in any way she could have ever possibly imagined. Her legacy was not one of power and prestige, but of a cautionary tale that strengthened the very community she had tried to subvert. The sound of crunching gravel was what signaled the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. It was the sound of the demolition crew's heavy machinery arriving on the Vandermeer property. Michael stood on his own land, a respectful distance away, and watched the process. He felt no glee, no triumphant cheer. Instead, he felt a solemn sense of closure. The massive, articulated arm of an excavator rose into the air, its metal claw poised over the ridiculous turret that had so offended the local skyline. With a deafening crunch of stucco and splintering wood, the claw came down, tearing a huge gash in the side of the house. It was a brutal, swift, and necessary act. He watched for an hour as the beige behemoth was systematically dismantled, reduced to a pile of rubble and rebar. It was an ugly end to an ugly chapter. But as the dust settled, the view that had been obstructed for months was restored. He could see the rolling hills to the east, the same hills his grandfather had admired from this very spot. The land was being freed, allowed to breathe again. It was a physical and metaphorical clearing of the air for the entire town. The legal fallout for Howard Henderson, the corrupt inspector, was significant. His testimony against Jessica earned him a reduced sentence, but he still served time in a low-security federal prison for accepting bribes. He lost his pension, his reputation, and the comfortable retirement he had tried to finance with his dishonesty. His story sent a chill through the network of municipal governments in the state. It was a clear message that turning a blind eye or accepting a backroom deal could have life-altering consequences. It forced other towns to review their own procedures, to tighten their oversight, and to root out any similar corruption that might be festering. In this way, the ripples from the stone Michael had dropped in his small pond spread much further than he could have imagined. His quiet stand for integrity in his own backyard ended up raising the standard for public service across the entire region. The positive changes that sprang from that one ugly conflict were a testament to the power of a single person choosing to do the right thing, no matter the personal cost. Michael often reflected on the advice his father had given him years ago, a piece of wisdom that had echoed in his mind throughout the ordeal. "Son," his father had said while they were repairing an old engine, "never start a fight, but always be prepared to finish it. And when you fight, don't fight mad. Fight smart. Use your head. Know the system better than your opponent, and let them defeat themselves." That advice had been his guiding principle. He hadn't reacted to Jessica's taunts with anger. He had absorbed her attacks, analyzed her strategy, and identified her fatal weakness, her own hypocrisy. He had simply held up a mirror, and she had been so enraged by her own reflection that she had shattered it, bringing the whole house of cards down on herself. It was the ultimate lesson in blue-collar philosophy. Don't get emotional. Understand the mechanics of the problem. Find the right tool for the job. And then apply steady, relentless pressure until the job is done. It had worked for him for 40 years as an engineer, and it had worked for him as the reluctant mayor of Northwood Creek. The story of the condemned mansion even brought a small, unexpected economic benefit to the town. The local newspaper article about the scandal was picked up by a regional news outlet, which then got syndicated to a national, crazy neighbors type of blog. For a few weeks, Northwood Creek became a minor tourist destination for people who wanted to drive by and see the infamous empty lot where the beige behemoth once stood. They would stop at the local diner for a piece of pie or buy gas at the town station. The locals were amused by the temporary fame. It was strange to have their quiet town be the subject of such public fascination, but it was also a source of pride. They had faced down a millionaire bully and won. They had protected their way of life. The short-lived notoriety faded, but the sense of community pride it engendered did not. They were the town that stood up for itself, a small dot on the map with a big reputation for integrity, a reputation that had been forged in the fire of Jessica Vandermeer's spectacular, self-inflicted downfall. In the end, it was all about the water. For Michael, the lake was a source of peace, a connection to his past, and a legacy for his future. It represented tranquility, history, and the natural order of things. For Jessica, The lake was just another asset to be acquired, a status symbol, an accessory for her garden parties. She never understood its true value, and that was her fundamental mistake. She saw a body of water, but Michael saw his soul. He fought for it, with the quiet ferocity of a man defending his own heart. The battle showed that some things are priceless. You cannot put a dollar value on a sunset reflected in calm water, or the sound of your grandchild's laughter echoing across a place your great-grandfather built with his own 2 hands. These are the things that make a life rich, the true treasures. And Michael Sterling, the quiet man from Northwood Creek, had proven that he was a very rich man indeed, in all the ways that truly mattered. His treasure was safe, not hoarded like a dragon's gold, but protected and shared with those who understood and respected its worth. One final, satisfying detail emerged from the legal proceedings. During the discovery phase, Jessica's lawyers were forced to turn over her communications. In one particularly arrogant email to a friend, written just after she first confronted Michael, she had written, "I've found the most perfect little lake, but it's being held hostage by some retired old nobody who thinks his family history matters. I'll have him and his little shack out of my way in a month. He doesn't know who he's dealing with." This email was read aloud in a pre-trial hearing, a perfect encapsulation of her hubris. The irony was devastating. It was she who didn't know who she was dealing with. She saw a shack. The town saw a heritage home. She saw a nobody. The community saw their mayor, their neighbor, their friend. She thought his history didn't matter, when in fact, it was the deep, unshakable foundation from which he drew all his strength. Her email was the perfect epitaph for her time in Northwood Creek. A monument to an arrogance so profound it was completely blind to the reality of the world around it. The restoration of the Vandermeer lot by the Conservation Trust was a community effort. On a bright Saturday morning, Michael, Arthur, David Chen, the Garbers, and 24 other volunteers arrived with shovels and saplings. They worked together, laughing and talking, to plant native pines, oaks, and maples. They were not just planting trees, they were reclaiming the land, healing the scar that Jessica had left on their community. They were replacing a symbol of greed and division with a symbol of growth, cooperation, and respect for nature. As Michael dug his hands into the rich soil, he felt a sense of profound rightness. This was the proper end to the story. Not destruction, but renewal. Not conflict, but community. The young trees would grow, and in time, the forest would be whole again. The memory of the beige behemoth would fade, but the memory of how the town came together to solve the problem would endure, its roots growing as deep and strong as the oaks they planted that day. The rallied community didn't just fade away after the victory. Inspired by their success, they formalized their group into the Northwood Creek Neighborhood Association, a proper, democratic one this time. They elected the retired plumber as their first president. Their mission wasn't to police their neighbors' lawn ornaments, but to provide a unified voice in town matters, to organize community events, and to help neighbors in need. They became a force for positive change. They organized a fundraiser to repair the roof on the town's small historical society building and volunteered to clean up the park along the creek. The adversarial energy that Jessica had brought to the town had been transmuted into a powerful, positive force for cooperation. It was a beautiful, unintended consequence. The bully had inadvertently created a shield against future bullies. She had wanted to create an HOA to serve her own ego, and in the end, she had been the catalyst for the creation of one that truly served the community she had held in such contempt. Michael's professional ally, David Chen, received a state-level award for excellence in municipal governance for his work on the Vandermeer case. At the award ceremony, he made a point to publicly thank Mayor Michael Sterling. "None of this would have been possible," David said from the podium, "without the integrity and courage of a leader who was not afraid to stand up for his community, and whose expert eye first noticed that something was wrong. He taught me that the most important part of this job isn't just enforcing the code, but understanding the community you're protecting." Vise. Michael was in the audience, feeling slightly embarrassed by the public praise, but also deeply proud of David. He saw in the young inspector the future of Northwood Creek. Bright, principled, and dedicated. He had passed the torch, and he knew the town was in good hands. He had stepped up when he was needed, and now he could step back, confident that the systems he had helped reinforce would hold strong for years to come. Jessica's spittle-flecked demand, "I demanded my lake," became a running joke in town. It was shorthand for any absurdly entitled request. If someone at the diner complained that their toast wasn't the exact right shade of brown, the waitress might quip, "What's next? Are you going to demand my lake?" It was a small, silly thing, but it was part of the healing process. Humor was their way of taking the power back, of reducing the intimidating figure of the millionaire bully to a comical punchline. The sarcastic humor that had been a quiet coping mechanism during the conflict now became a shared language of victory. It served to highlight the sheer absurdity of Jessica's worldview and the foolishness of her self-inflicted downfall. They weren't laughing at her out of cruelty, but out of a deep and abiding sense of cosmic justice. She had become a local folk villain, a character in a story they would tell for generations, a reminder that in Northwood Creek, common sense and a good sense of humor would always win out over unbridled entitlement. The change in Michael was subtle but profound. He had always been a principled man, but the conflict with Jessica had hardened that principle into something unshakable. He had been tested, and he had not been found wanting. The experience stripped away the last vestiges of his reluctance to lead. He still had no desire for political office, but he accepted his role as a respected elder in the community. People sought his advice, not just on electrical problems, but on town issues, on neighborly disputes, on matters of principle. He was a quiet, steadying presence, a living example of integrity. He had stared into the face of corruption and greed and had not flinched. He had been content before, but now his contentment was deeper, forged in the fires of conflict and tempered by the cool waters of justice. He had protected his sanctuary, but in the process, he had become a sanctuary of sorts for the entire community, a rock they knew they could depend on. The wise elder, Arthur Pendleton, lived long enough to see the young saplings on the old Vandermeer lot grow taller than he was. He would often sit with Michael on the porch, and they would look over at the burgeoning forest. "You did a good thing, Michael," Arthur said one afternoon, his voice frail but clear. "You didn't just get rid of a bad neighbor. You reminded everyone what this town is all about." Michael just nodded, content to let the silence and the sentiment hang in the air. Arthur's approval, the approval of a man who was the living memory of Northwood Creek, meant more to him than any award or public accolade. It was a validation from the town's very soul. The torch was being passed. The history that Michael had fought to protect was now being entrusted to him, not just as a descendant, but as a proven guardian. The legacy of Sterling Lake was now intertwined with the legacy of the man who had saved it, ensuring that both would be remembered for generations to come. In the final analysis, the story was a classic David versus Goliath narrative, but with a modern, suburban twist. Goliath was not a giant warrior, but a wealthy woman armed with lawyers and an overinflated sense of entitlement. David was not a young shepherd, but a retired electrician, armed with a deep knowledge of his trade and an unshakable moral compass. And the slingshot was not a weapon of stone, but the rule of law itself. Michael had simply picked up the tool that Jessica had tried to use against him and had wielded it with far greater skill and precision. It was an inspirational justice story that resonated far beyond the borders of Northwood Creek, a tale that gave hope to anyone who had ever felt bullied or overlooked by the wealthy and powerful. It was a reminder that sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one with the most power, and that no fortress of lies is strong enough to withstand the simple, steady pressure of the truth. As the sun set on another peaceful day in Northwood Creek, Michael Sterling looked out over the calm, dark water of his lake. The reflection of the first evening star shimmered on its surface. His life was quiet again, the way he liked it. The battle was a memory, but its lessons were etched into the fabric of the town forever. He had faced a petty tyrant, and had not only won, but had emerged with his integrity intact and his community stronger. He had proven that one man, standing on principle, could move mountains or, in this case, demolish a mansion. The lake was more than just water to him. It was a mirror of his own life, calm on the surface, but with a deep, quiet strength beneath. And it would remain that way, a peaceful sanctuary for his family, and a symbol of enduring justice for the town he called home.